the other thing I did that was really critical, and I got this idea from a pastor in Houston and another pastor here in Atlanta. I built what's called a preaching team. And I got all the ministry assistants, so like kind of the administrative staff.
Yeah, you told me about this. I think this is brilliant.
And because I never been, I rarely had been to Roswell. I had never been to the church. I didn't know the congregation. I didn't know their lives. I'd been in a very different context. And so I was really worried, how am I going to connect? Because you really only have 3 or 4 weeks of sermons until, if people aren't feeling you, they'll go somewhere else, because there's just too many great churches here and too many great preachers in the Atlanta area, okay? So I gathered the ministry assistants, and on Thursdays at 1:30, I basically delivered the sermon to them. And I still do it to this day. Every Thursday at 1:30, they gather in a little classroom. There's about, there's any 6 to 10 of them. And I deliver the sermon. And then they give me feedback. And I told them, I want you to be as ruthless as possible. I want you to tell me the truth. And they are.
This is the Workplace Therapist Show, and of course, I'm your host, Brandon Smith. And today, we're going to talk about leadership lessons. That's our theme this year, but we're going to talk about it in an interesting way. We're going to talk about what are some of those lessons that can be learned when you ascend in the church world. So when you move up into the role of senior pastor, what is some of the challenges of leading a congregation, leading any kind of religious institution, and what are some of the things that you have to kind of navigate in order to kind of even get to that role? So to join me in this conversation, I've got a good friend of mine and the senior pastor of my church, Reverend Jeff Meyers.
Brandon, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be welcomed by you. You've done so much for me in my transition here at Roswell Press, and it's a real honor to be invited to the podcast.
Yeah, I'm really excited to have you on the show.
But you can't tell any secrets.
No, I know, no secrets. I really want to.
I know you do.
I mean, it's like right here. It's just the two of us.
Yeah, we may have to edit in post-production.
So, all right, so Jeff, so today you're the senior pastor of Roswell Press. About how many folks are in that congregation?
So we have about 2,500 members. Then we have about 850 to 1,000 in worship on a Sunday. Easter Sunday, 3,000, maybe even more on a Christmas Eve.
Yeah, and in the Presbyterian church, that's a pretty large congregation.
Yeah, it's a very large congregation. And the cool thing that separates RPC and makes it distinctive is we have about a third of the congregation is 30 and under, a third is about 30 to 60, and a third is 60 and over. So the age demographic is really spread out nicely.
Yeah, I heard Isaac say, "Wow, was that you, Isaac, that said wow?" Yeah, because in a lot of churches, that's not the case.
Right.
It's typically not that kind of balance. You might have some that are more kind of cooler, hipper startup churches with younger congregation. A lot of congregations older demographics, aging demographics.
Yep.
So it's kind of had that balance.
Yeah, and so like as a preacher, you got to think so. For one demographic, you want to talk about Drake, and another demographic, you want to talk about Frank Sinatra. And that you got to keep that in mind, because you want to appeal to everybody and speak to everybody in their language that they understand.
Yeah, and in many ways, that makes it a lot harder in some ways to design a sermon, because you've got to try and think, how do I get this message across? Yeah,
exactly. But for me, it makes it more fun, because everything is material, and I can tell a story about my 1-year-old son. I can tell a story about my grandparents that relates to everybody. And it's really fun to be that creative and say, like the 75-year-old grandpa. I remember one Sunday he comes up to me, he's like, "Who is this Drake fella you've been talking about?" And I said, "Well, ask your granddaughter about him." And so the next day he comes into the church office and he goes, "I had no idea who Drake was. And my granddaughter was so impressed when I asked her about him." And so it was cool to, kind of help people learn about the world that they're not maybe familiar with so much.
Bridging the generations.
That's one thing I do.
One sermon at a time. It's beautiful. Love it.
Must never be boring. So
yeah. So, okay. So, and just to give us just a context, and how big is the staff?
So we have, I think, 48 to 49 staff members. We also have a preschool that's included in that.
Okay. So you're kind of got that piece of it. We've got the organizational leadership piece, and then we've got kind of the leading the congregation piece.
Yep.
In terms of kind of general roles and responsibilities. All right. So since the theme of our show this year is kind of leadership lessons, this is going to make the show a fun kind of story time show.
Cool.
So let's kind of go back a little bit and kind of start us on this journey. What even got you into the ministry in the first place?
Sure.
And what were some of the things that you kind of learned along the way? So maybe we can kind of start and kind of think of it as kind of a couple chapters.
Sure. So early on, I'm from Spokane, Washington. I grew up in a Christian home that was very conservative. And I say that like real focus on the Bible, traditional values, and all that. And I'm deeply, deeply appreciative of that experience. But when I got to college, all of a sudden, I encountered the historical critical study of the Bible, different religions. I met atheists in Seattle. I went to the University of Washington. And so that was really caused me to start to doubt and wrestle with what did I believe? So first I decided to be a business major because I believed I wanted to make a lot of money. That was my goal.
Yeah.
And my senior year, I ended up interning randomly at University Presbyterian Church in their college ministry. And through that experience, I discovered, I'd kind of gotten by in undergrad by like being sarcastic and, getting B's. And I didn't try very hard. And all of a sudden I realized I had deep theological and philosophical questions that I had to answer. I felt like I couldn't move on with my life until I answered them. So I applied to a bunch of seminaries. I got into Princeton Theological Seminary. I actually deferred for 2 years, and they sent me this email, and they said, you have to come next year or you're going to have to reapply. And I said, I am coming. And so I went, I'm going to go to Princeton. I've got these questions. I'm going to answer them, and then I'm going to go back into business. I'm going to live the rest of my life. Okay. Well, I remember that one of the first days I was at Princeton, I needed a job. So I got a job at the Princeton Seminary Library, which is one of the largest theological libraries in the world. And I remember the first day I was there, and I'm there on the Princeton campus, and I'm like, okay, there's all these smart people. They're going to answer all my questions. I'm going to tie this up. Okay, I got 3 years to do this. So they give me a rack of books that I need to go down and shelve in the basement of the seminary library. And it takes me down, and it's this old rickety elevator, I'm like, I hope this holds me in the books, and so it kind of goes down and the doors open and it's pitch black in there. And I push my little rickety cart out into the aisle, and I'm kind of fumbling around looking for the light switch, and I flip it on and the lights come on. It was very dramatic. And all of a sudden I'm looking out and I see from floor to ceiling are racks of books. I mean, thousands and thousands of books. And there are 3 levels above me. And I realize that if I spend the rest of my life, every waking minute reading, I will not be able to read all of these books. And all of a sudden, I go into an existential panic. I've just moved all the way across the country to answer my questions. And all of a sudden, I realize I will not be able to get all the information I need to answer those questions because there will always be more information. Now, kids these days, they know this because they are on the internet, and you go on this infinite search where you just keep clicking hyperlinks. It goes to the next link, to the next link, to the next link. And so all of a sudden, I had to reconfigure my approach to my spiritual and religious questions. And so, I encountered a saint from the 12th century, St. Anselm. He said, theology is faith seeking understanding. Faith seeking understanding, which is a very different approach than I have a series of questions. I'm going to answer these questions and wrap it up in a bow, right? Yeah. And so then that launched me into my spiritual journey, right? And that I knew that I would never be able to get an infinite God in my finite brain. But I needed to find a way that I could explore and live my life and engage these questions because they are important, but realize there will always be more questions, right? And so, over those 3 years, I thought I was going to go on to do a PhD, in ethics and human rights. That was not in the cards. And so all of a sudden I realized I needed to get a job as I approached graduation. And so I applied and I got a job at a church. I wanted to be at a Presbyterian church in a university environment where I could get the experience to preach. There were 2 positions in the country, and one happened to be in Atlanta, Georgia, and I got it. The pastor there, Scott Weimer, happened to be in New York City one week, and he called me up. He said, can you get lunch? And so we met up for lunch at this Mexican restaurant, and that Mexican restaurant changed my life. He called me, came down, and I served there for about 11 years. And there I started out, it was a church of about 1,000 members, university environment. And so I got there and he says, okay, Jeff, I want you to be in charge and preach at the evening service, which was primarily for college students and young adults. And I was like, great, that's awesome. And then all of a sudden it hit me. It was like, I have 3 sermons that I wrote in seminary. And once I was done with those, I was like, what am I going to do? Because every week, that's a lot of content. And so that was really fun because I like reading widely, listening to podcasts like yours, doing a lot of fun stuff. And so
good plug. Did you hear him say that? He listens to my podcast.
You put that on the commercial. And so all of a sudden I had to preach every week. And so that was really a great experience to really work through my questions, because what I discovered is a lot of the questions that I had and started to answer, other people had. And so, and a lot of people think these questions, they're the only ones. Why does bad things happen to good people? How do we reconcile different religious practices? Where did the Bible come from? These kinds of questions, a lot of people, I think they're the only ones with them. And when you can say, actually, a lot of Christian thinkers throughout the ages, through 2,000 years, have been asking and answering these very questions. And so it became really fun to engage the religious tradition and show where it intersects with our current contemporary questions and context.
Yeah. So I've always had this question. When you enter into the ministry, do you always start in youth ministry? Is that just the path that everyone always has to start in?
Not always, but usually, because you're young, you're ripe. Many times you're single. And so, youth ministry, college ministry, it takes a lot of time. You got to be out there with young people, and it takes a lot of energy. And, as you get older, I'm, 41 now. I'm like, holy cow, how did I ever do that? And you're closer to their age, so you can relate. When you get to my age, you're like, oh, what is it like to be 13? What is it like to have to worry and panic about finals week?
You are wearing a pair of Yeezys, though.
That is nice. True. Do you want me to show them to the camera?
Oh, you're picking them up. There they are. You're very proud of those. My boys are very impressed.
Well,
Noah's like, he's cool.
I don't know about that. I'm just poor now. No, I like it. It's funny. I've always been into sneakers, since I played basketball in high school, and it's fun, to kind of wear them because I preach in them, as you know, and the kids love it. It gives us a good conversation starter, to engage with them in their world, and but I don't let them touch them.
You said that with such a level of seriousness.
Absolutely.
You were smiling until that moment. They can't touch those. They can touch those. All right, so let's stay on that first kind of chapter for a minute. So you're doing college ministry. You're evolving your ability to preach and connect. Was there any particular kind of learnings you had in that season where you learned a little bit more about who you are, or maybe even challenges you had to overcome?
Okay, I would say, okay, number one, I had to learn adaptability. Okay, by this I mean, when I came in, I had this idea about what the job would be. I said, I'm gonna preach, I'm gonna lead Bible studies, and I'm not gonna be a party planner. I'm not gonna be an event guy. I want to do spiritual, religious things. Well, I know this is gonna be surprising to you, Brandon, but young people don't always want to do Bible studies. They don't always want to do spiritual things. They don't always want to come to church. And so I had to figure out, okay, how am I gonna convene people together? And so I remember about 2 or 3 years in, all of a sudden I said, I've got to become a party planner. And that's what I did. I mean, I hosted big parties, Halloween parties, Valentine's Day parties, Christmas parties in my house. I'd have 100 folks there, 150 people. And it gave an opportunity for people who were members at the church to invite friends who were maybe a little suspicious about the religious world. They'd never been to church. And so it was a low barrier to entry. And that was really critical, as I had to adapt to the context I was in, and I had to shift my ministry from who I was and do some things I didn't like. I tell people, when you in a job, when you have to do the things you don't like, that's what you get paid for. If they could get somebody to do your job for free, they would, right?
Yeah.
And so that was something that I really had to learn. So adaptability, I encountered this word, velleity. Have you ever heard it? Velleity.
Vell. I feel like I'm on a spelling bee. Vell.
EITY.
I know.
Velleity. It's the lowest form of volition, okay. Of willingness. It's this. If the world was this way, I would do this. If the world was how I wanted it to be, if people were like how I wanted them to do it, I would do this. It's the lowest form of volition, because the world isn't how I always want it to be. People don't act as I want them to. But how do they act? How is the world? How do I live in the real world, how it really is, and not in an illusion, or delusional world? That's a lot of maturity and growing up, and that took a lot from me. Okay, so adaptability. I would also say scale was learning how to lead with scale, okay? Because, when I started out, I think, we had a dinner club and 3 people showed up, right? I'm like, wow, this is quite a ministry we have going here, Jesus said where 2 or 3 are gathered. Well, at least we got 3. But then we started to grow. And eventually, I think we were reaching, 300 folks. But when we got to about 10 to 20, I had my elders. So at a Presbyterian church, the governing board is made up of elders, and they're kind of leaders in their own lives and, in their own businesses and nonprofits and whatnot. And my elder, who was responsible for college and young adult ministries, was this guy who was the senior leader at Habitat for Humanity that was responsible for their global strategic planning process. And one time, I remember he pulled me aside. He said, Jeff, the way you're going, you're relying on yourself to do everything, okay? You're teaching all the time. You're sending all the emails. You're hosting the parties. Okay, you're relying on yourself. And your approach to ministry and your approach to leadership is putting a very low ceiling on the number of people you can reach. You have got to train up other leaders to do the work of leadership and do the work of ministry so that you can bless more folks. And that really was a paradigm shift for me. Okay, how can I train up? How can I recognize people with gifts? How can I call them forth, encourage them, and then enable them? So let go of the reins of leadership in many ways and let them lead. Okay? And so that allowed us to really grow the ministry. And that's been really pivotal for me as I come to Roswell Press, which is such a big organization that I can't do everything. Yeah. And it's not all about me. And so how do I think good leaders do the things that only they can do.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, if we look in the business world, we'd say you learn that critical skill of delegation. Mm-hmm. So, and there's often this term, particularly when in the startup business world, small business world, you'd say you have to go from working in the business to on the business.
Oh, interesting.
You had to go from working kind of in the ministry to on the ministry. You had to kind of go from in to on.
Yeah.
And delegation's kind of that key trigger. Well, I think Isaac's cueing us to go to break. So let's go to break. When we come back from break, I want to then kind of carry on a little bit further into your journey, and then ultimately into the role that you're sitting in today and some of the kind of challenges you had to overcome.
Okay, I'll be here.
So stay tuned. We're going to go to break. We'll be right back. Hey, this is Brandon with your coaching minute for the week. So one of the very simple tips that I give my clients that I find to be extremely helpful and beneficial with their direct reports, so for those manager clients of mine, is to do this. So at some point in the year, often about halfway between the time you give the performance review and the next performance review, so that 6-month mark, during your one-on-ones with your direct reports, at the end of the one-on-ones, I want you to ask your direct reports the start, stop, continue question. So in other words, you ask them this: what can I start doing to support you better? What can I stop doing that's getting in your way? And what can I continue doing that will help support you more? And what they come back to me and tell me is they say, oh my gosh, it was so amazing to hear not only the feedback, but how different each of my direct reports are and what they need from me. So think about a time this year when you can do that. Now, one more important thing around this tip: make sure you let your direct reports know that you're going to do that so they can think and prepare prior to that meeting. I promise you'll not only feel better, but you'll thank me for doing that. So that is your coaching minute for the week. I look forward to hearing how it goes. Welcome back from break. Of course, this is the Workplace Therapist Show, and I'm your host, Brandon Smith. So in our first part of our show, Reverend Jeff Meyers was kind of sharing with us kind of the journey of his career. And so last we left off your story, Jeff, you were still doing college ministry. You were scaling things. You were doing dinner clubs. You were learning how to delegate, learning how to get other people to kind of equip them to do the ministry. So did that just kind of continue on when you were at that church, or was there any other kind of learnings that you had before you made the pivot over to RPC?
No, in fact, there were several critical moments. There was one time when I was at North Avenue. I'd been there maybe 6 years, and I got a really bad review from my boss. And I'd been going through some real personal challenges, and I was really irritated and angry. And I was like, how am I going to deal with this frustration I had? And so I wrote this kind of like epic 3-page single-spaced response to my review and sent it to the HR team, because I was just like, I felt like it didn't justly represent my effort and what I had done. And then I ended up getting my boss's job actually when he left, and the HR team, I'll still bump into some of those folks. They'll still laugh about it. But it was a way that I could deal with a problem and confront a real disagreement I had. But in a productive way. And so eventually I continued to move up and oversaw more and more parts of the organization.
Did responding that way work? Did it have the effect you wanted? Okay.
Yeah, because I was able to do it in a clear-headed way where I really went point by point about and gave evidence of, okay, this is what I did. I didn't think this review took into account all of this evidence. And I think it was, the HR team was able to look at the evidence, and then the senior leadership were able to say, okay, we understand this was unfair. And they really treated me with respect, and it was really helpful. And it was a learning process to kind of how to deal with disagreement, because I can be kind of conflict avoidant. Don't tell my wife I said that. And and so it was a good learning experience. But as I went on there at the church, maybe when I'd been there about 9 years, the senior pastor went through a real personal tragedy where his son died by suicide, and it was devastating. The whole church, the whole community was just didn't know what to do. And, I did his service, and it was just a time of deep grief, almost despair, walking with my boss at the time. And he took about 3 months away of personal leave. And so I really had to step into his chair in a time of emotional distress. And nothing had prepared me for that moment. I mean, my whole life had, but I'd never encountered, they didn't teach me about what to do in seminary. And so I had to kind of learn on the fly. And one of the things that I think I really learned that has helped me going forward is this concept of providing leadership with a non-anxious presence. Okay. When you're the senior leader, everybody feeds off you. If you're anxious, they feel anxious. If you're happy, they feel a little happy. If you're angry, they start getting angry. It allows permission. It encourages kind of whatever you're feeling. It kind of bleeds out into the organization. And so for me, I really had to think through how I felt and articulate it in a non-anxious way that allowed people to feel their grief, their maybe anger, their frustration, but also to step with people that were experiencing joy and in permitting that as well. And so that was really helpful for me during a really, really hard time. And I think that experience of leading during that time really gave Roswell Press, their hiring team, their search team, as they interviewed me, I was able to talk about that because other than that, I'd really had no head of staff experience. And so to talk about that, I think was helpful for them to say, okay, he can deal with emergency situations. He can think thoughtfully about difficult times and challenges.
Yeah, and I think while all organizations have a challenge with emotion, people feeling stressed or anxious or fearful or grieving. I think in a church situation where you've got all of people's lives as part of that story, it becomes even more so. Yeah. Learning how to kind of be with people and be comfortable in different emotional states.
Yes. I think I hadn't really thought about it. The other day I was reading, Bob Iger, the CEO of Disney, just put out a leadership book. And that was one of the things he talked about, the non-anxious presence, about how your kind of internal emotions radiate throughout the organization. And I was kind of looking back on that experience saying, I kind of did it intuitively without much thought, but now I think it was really helpful. in all sorts of organizations, not just churches.
Yeah, good kind of reminder for us that's so important when we're leading people, that our energy, the way we show up, people are going to feed off that no matter what it is.
Because you don't think about, you have to be really self-conscious to think about it, right?
Yeah.
Because because a lot of times when you're the senior leader and you're leading people, no one wants to, or rarely do people want to challenge you. Sometimes people won't tell you the tough truth because they want to make you happy. They don't want to irritate you. They want you to like them. And so you got to figure out, okay, how can I get those voices in my life that were willing to challenge me, to make me better, and also allow people the freedom to tell you, hey, you treated me like a jerk. Hey, you made me go home and cry yesterday. You wronged me. You need to ask for forgiveness. And so that's, especially as a Christian leader, to be able to admit where we're wrong and change and go in a different direction and change our behavior is really important, because it's critical to the Christian life.
Yeah, that vulnerability, so much more so.
Yeah.
All right, so then, okay, you get the role as senior pastor. What was then different? What were some ahas for you that you realized, wow, there's a lot more pieces to this that maybe I hadn't. So you're at RBC, you're senior pastor.
Well, I remember the first day I came into the office and I sat behind my desk and I thought, what have I gotten myself into? And I felt really overwhelmed. There were a number of people, you being one of them, that really helped me be thoughtful about the transition. I said, okay, I can't do everything all at once, but what do I need to do? What's the plan? And so I really broke it up into 90 days. And I said, okay, for the first 30 days, what am I going to do? And so I focused in on the staff. I'm going to meet all the staff. I'm going to try to take every staff member to lunch or coffee, okay, and get to know them on a personal level, okay? Then the next 30 days, I'm going to look at the session, okay? And the next 30 days, I'm going to broaden out to the larger congregation.
And the session, just for folks who don't know,
is the board, the board of directors.
Yeah.
And so that made it manageable to think about in kind of concentric circles about how we were going to strategize. I also got this idea that we had, I think there were a dozen desserts we had, where we broke up the congregation into groups of 200 or 300, where they were invited to come to dessert. I kind of told them a story about what brought me to Roswell Press, who I was, and then I handed out surveys where I asked, what was your greatest joy here at the church? What was your greatest sorrow here at the church? What's your hope for the future? And so I had all this data that I had from the congregation that I could look at and say, okay, these are who these people are. This is what they care about. And then they got to know me and ask me questions. And so we did that in the first 90 days, a dozen of those desserts, which was really great. The other thing I did that was really critical, and I got this idea from a pastor in Houston and another pastor here in Atlanta. I built what's called a preaching team. And I got all the ministry assistants, so kind of the administrative staff.
Yeah, you told me about this. I think this is brilliant.
And because I rarely had been to Roswell. I had never been to the church. I didn't know the congregation. I didn't know their lives. I'd been in a very different context. And so I was really worried, how am I going to connect? Because you really only have 3 or 4 weeks of sermons until, if people aren't feeling you, they'll go somewhere else, because there's just too many great churches here and too many great preachers in the Atlanta area, okay? So I gathered the ministry assistants, and on Thursdays at 1:30, I basically delivered the sermon to them. And I still do it to this day. Every Thursday at 1:30, they gather in a little classroom. There's about, there's any 6 to 10 of them. And I deliver the sermon. And then they give me feedback. And I told them, I want you to be as ruthless as possible. I want you to tell me the truth. And they are. Oh, they are. I said, don't be that. Don't make me cry now. Come on. But one of the things, and so I asked them, what resonated with you? What did you not understand? What did I talk about 3 weeks ago that I'm talking about again? What makes sense? Do we need a different conclusion? Did it grab your attention at the beginning? And they help me. And they also are able to say, hey, Jeff, no one cares about, 14th century, Gregorian Orthodox theology. Could you bring it down a little bit to our level? And I'm like, oh, okay, yeah, I can do that. Thank you. And so it's very helpful where they really give me wisdom. And it ends up that they're all women too, which is really fun. And so they'll be like, Jeff, there's a lot of mothers out here. You need to be speaking more to mothers. You're talking about, all these dad issues, but you need to talk about moms. And that was a blind spot I didn't recognize. And so that's been really helpful in me connecting with the congregation. And then also it's a special time that I get with them because I don't interact with them very often, that we get an hour together and we get to talk about our personal lives. It's a lot of fun.
So I heard a couple things in there. The first thing you did when you took on the role was you really were very thoughtful about who are those key kind of stakeholders that you can build those relationships with. And then you kind of ordered it. You got staff, we've got the session, which is like a board of directors kind of, and then we've got, members of the congregation, right? And really kind of build those relationships. But then also, as you were thinking about preaching, how do I kind of create a team that can give me feedback? And again, speaks to vulnerability, be open to that, and it helps you get better, but then also allows you to connect.
Yeah.
So I think of being a senior pastor of a church as one of the toughest jobs in the world, because you really can't fire a lot of folks. It's really all influencing. And you have to have so many different skill sets. You've got to be good in one-on-one pastoral care, right? In some of people's darkest moments. You've got to be a good teacher in small groups. You also got to be able to have presence in a large group, and have that kind of that edutainment component. And then edutainment.
Oh, I like that. I hadn't heard that, man. You just coined a new term. We're both learning new words.
We're going to use that. It's coming out in the next sermon. I can see it now.
As the great Brandon Smith once said, edutainment.
But then there's also that other piece where you've got to be a good administrator. You got to be thinking about budget, and you got to be thinking about numbers, and you got to think about staff. So talk a little about, since that is so many skill sets, and no one can be great at all those.
Right.
How did you assess what was the right fit for you, and then what were things that you need to have other people kind of compliment you on?
Okay, so I think I had to be really clear about gifts and weaknesses, strengths and weaknesses about my own, okay? And so one of the things I did was, we had 3 women who are great senior leaders at the church when I got hired. Reverend Lindsay Slocum, Reverend Emily Wright, and Nancy Turner, who was our business administrator. And I came in and sat down with each of them and said, okay, I know you've been in this interim time and you guys have led in some really powerful ways. Now is a time I'm going to have to take some of those responsibilities, because that's really the head of staff role. But I want you guys to be successful and be able to grow in new ways, okay? So I sat down with each of them and kind of talked through, and Emily Wright was like, I want to be a senior pastor. And I said, okay, what can we do to help you get a position where you're going to be a head of staff, because you are so gifted and so talented? But in the meantime, what can we give you to kind of sink your teeth into and grow in new ways? And so she started contemporary service and our community group initiative, 2 of the key strategic initiatives of the church. She did that faithfully for about 2 years, and then she got a call to a big church in Austin, Texas, and she's doing awesome, okay? Yep. And then the other person was Lindsay Slocum. And so Lindsay and I sat down, and she says, you know what? I want to be an executive pastor. I don't really want to be a senior pastor yet. And she could totally. She's a gifted preacher, gifted leader. She says, I really want to be an executive. I want to administrate the staff. And I said, perfect. Because I don't think I'm going to have the time to do that. And that's not where my passion is. And that is your passion. And she is so gifted. And so she eventually ascended to become our executive pastor.
She's incredible at that.
Yeah. And she just did such a good job. And then Nancy Turner was like, Jeff, she's a business administrator. She said, Jeff, I want to retire in about a year, maybe 2 years. Once you get your feet on the ground, how can I help you? And she was so diligent and said, okay, Jeff, here's how the budget works. here's how you work an Excel spreadsheet. Here's all the little funds that we use to minister. Here are our partners, our nonprofits in the community. And so getting the senior leadership was really key and getting their buy-in made sure that they were on my team and we were a united front in leading the staff and the congregation.
Yeah, it sounds like, and you had those conversations with both, which were led with where do they want to go.
Yep.
And then the second part was, okay, let's talk about giving you things that will help you get there, but also will take things off your plate.
Yep.
So it's kind of that distribution. Yeah. Okay. This is awesome. So if you had, before we kind of start to wrap towards close, for those folks that are maybe leading a church or even some cases a nonprofit and they've kind of moved into that senior role, is there any one piece of advice you'd have to give them on what they need to do first or where they need to start?
I would say number one is you can't lead the people if you don't love the people. And people have to feel your love for them, their children, their grandparents, and they will not follow.
For those of you that can't see him, he's pointing at me while he's doing
Come on,
he's
man.
Like pointing at me like you gotta.
Because you know what? If if you go leading people and you go out and you look behind you and there's no one behind you, you're just out for a walk.
Yeah, that's true. It's true. So I ask all my guests this question. What's one life hack you have for us to help us live a life more free from dysfunction?
Well, I don't know if this would be helpful to everybody, but this is my one thing. And for people with tight hamstrings and back problems, this could be the key. This could be the key to health and wellness. So when I was 21, I threw out my lower back, and every 3 to 6 months I would re-injure it. Okay, and it was terrible. And I did it. That went on for about a dozen years. And finally, I met a woman who had a brother-in-law physical therapist in New York, and gave me this idea. Actually, I'd gone to an orthopedic surgeon who said I had the tightest hamstrings he'd ever seen.
Wow.
Okay, he's a surgeon for the Atlanta Braves, so he'd seen some tight hamstrings. And so they gave me this stretch where I stand up over my sink, and you lift your front toes off the ground, and then you bend at the waist, keeping your legs straight. And that stretches all of your ligaments. Now, the life hack here is to make sure you do it every day. I do it while I brush my teeth. I have an electric toothbrush. I'm over the sink. I do it every day while I brush my teeth.
And it's worked?
It's changed my life.
Changed his life.
Maybe it can change yours.
That's nice. This was awesome, man. So if people want to learn more about you, more about Roswell Pres, where can they go?
Go to roswellpress.org. All the information is there. We got links to sermons and videos and all the information about our great mission partners in Roswell and really around the world.
Yeah. Thanks for coming on the show, man.
Thanks for having me, Brandon.
I'm sure I'm going to have you back.
Love the show.
And thanks for listening and watching the show. Of course, keep up the fight every single week. And by listening and passing on the great information that we share with others, and review the show. That's how others find us. If you want additional resources, you can go to my site, theworkplacetherapist.com, where there's blogs, past podcasts, articles, the Workplace Happiness Workbook, and other things to make your life that much smoother and more free from dysfunction. So until our next show, have a great week and an awesome life.